So let's take a look at the history brush. It's another new brush in ZBrush 2020. And what this allows us to do is blend out or erase or clone various history states. So to begin with, I've got some history on this character right now. And there's another new tool that I'd like to show you. If we go to the Edit menu, we can actually truncate our history. I can step back with my undo counter to previous versions, and then I can delete the history before that or delete the history above it. I want to delete everything that came before the point that I'm at now. So I'll go to Edit. I'll turn my undo counter all the way up to the top. So that's my last undo. And I'm going to delete older history. So we're starting fresh. It's very, very nice to be able to use this, especially if you're going to be using the history brush, because you can accumulate quite a bit of history, and it can be a little bit hard to navigate it if you've got thousands of history states up there. So this allows us to get rid of maybe the very beginnings of the sculpture that you really don't need, and focus in on those undos that matter the most. So here we've got our character, and let's start to add some details to the skin. So I'm going to go ahead and mask out this little bit here. I'm going to use the noise maker, like I've done in a couple of the other tutorials, to create sort of an interesting skin texture just on the top of the head here. There we go. And I'll step down a couple subdivision levels, invert the mask, and then feather it so we get a nice feathered edge on it. Then we'll step back up to the highest subdivision level. And I'll go to Surface, Noise. Let's orient the character so we can see it in the noise window here. The navigation, of course, is just like ZBrush. Go to the noise plugin and do Veroni. Veroni, I think, makes a really nice kind of bumpy skin texture. We'll turn Mix Basic Noise down to 0. We'll turn the strength up until we can actually see it. And then we'll turn the scale down until we get a nice sort of bumpy, scaly skin texture there. So I'll click OK. Now, we always want to make sure that the strength is a little bit more than we think we need, because when we bake this down into the mesh, it often loses some of its fidelity. So I'm going to turn the strength up just a little bit higher than I think I need. There we go, and now I'll click Apply to Mesh, and that'll bake that noise down into the sculpture so it becomes part of the actual detail of the model. There we go. Now we can clear the mask. Now, let's say I want to go back and blend out the history state before we had that bumpy detail. So what I can do is I'll just go back in my undos to before we added that. I need to make sure that I'm at my highest subdivision level on that undo state. There we go. I will first off, I'll go to B for brush, H for history, and select the history recall brush. Now I'm going to control click on this history state, and you see it turns white. Now we'll go back to the last history state. You see there's our stored history state there. If I take my brush and I start to blend out, oops, I have to turn off symmetry mode. That's one nuance of this brush that you have to be aware of. It also works best if you're sort of looking straight down at the area that you want to blend out. So there we go. You can see that I can very softly blend out this detail. I'll turn down my Z intensity on the brush so it's not quite so strong. And this is a really great way of taking an area of high detail and then blending it out into another area, which is always a little bit tricky. You know, when you're working with alphas and detailing a mesh, sometimes you can find yourself having some trouble trying to transition one area of detail into another, and this makes it really easy to do that. I can use it as an eraser by simply turning up my intensity to 100%, and I can completely restore that history state, just like that. You see, it's effectively an eraser in that case. There we go. Now, of course, I can turn down my Z intensity, and I can turn down my focal shift, and really use it as a subtle blender. So that's really my favorite way of using this brush. And it's nice too because it frees me up to go in and really push and experiment with details, knowing that I can blend them off quite easily later. So for example, if I go to my clay tubes brush and select Alpha 58, I'll control click on that alpha undo state. Let's control click on it. That deselects it. Now we'll go back to our last state here. And with the clay tubes brush with Alpha 58, this allows us to create these really nice raised wrinkles like you see here. I'll turn my Z intensity down and we'll just run a few of these along the cheeks here. So I really like this brush because it creates these wrinkles that very naturally go from high point to high point. So you end up stretching the sort of wrinkly skin in between the high points of the folds of the face. Let's do another one here, through here, through here. And I don't even have to smooth this back because what I'm going to do is use the history brush to blend it off. And that's very, very nice because smoothing is a little destructive, but the history brush is just sort of like turning down the volume on this detail. There we go. Maybe run some through here and run some through here. Now I'm going to go back in my undos to before we put that detail on. There we go. Perfect. Control click on this undo state, then go to our last undo state. Now I'll go to my B for brush, H for history, and select the history recall brush. It's B for brush, H for history. Now we'll turn our Z intensity down, and here you can see this is just like a blender, just a soft blender. I can knock back this detail, and I can just keep building up my brush stroke in the areas that I want to really fade it out to nothing, because it is cumulative each time I run the brush stroke across it. So we'll knock back this detail here and through here. So watch this area. We're just going to go ahead and turn down the volume, as it were, on this detail through this area. Now, this history recall brush is a wonderful way of blending out detail. I'd like to show you another method that you can use for this, just so you have another tool in your arsenal, and that is storing a morph target and using the morph brush. So if I go to the morph target menu here and store a morph targets are just a copy of the mesh in memory. So if I make a big change here using the move brush and come back here and switch, I can switch between those two versions of my mesh, the stored morph target and the altered mesh. Now you can only have one morph target at a time. So if I store a morph target here, and then if I were to go in and, let's say, we'll take the standard brush with the spray stroke and dot alpha, and let's use this to create some kind of a detail on the surface. Now if I go to B for brush, M for morph, we have a morph brush here. You can see the hotkey is O. Turn my Z intensity down, and this does effectively the same thing. It's just blending off to that stored morph target. So the benefit of the history brush is that you have the access to all of your stored history. So you can go back to any undo state and blend out the model to that point. The morph target and the morph brush is very, very nice because it's very fast. You don't have to store an undo state. And I'll use this a lot before I put down an area of real heavy detail, knowing that I'm going to want to blend it off with the previous state. And there we go. And once again, this can be used as an eraser by just turning it up to 100%, and that will erase that detail out completely. So that is the history recall brush, as well as the morph brush. It is a wonderful way of taking your model and restoring and mixing states from any part of your undo history. It's a wonderful blending brush. It's a wonderful sort of hacking brush. So you You don't have to feel like you can't get back, or you can't, once one particular stroke is set in stone, you can always go back, store and undo history, and then blend that off. So I find it really, really liberating and really valuable as a brush in the tool set. I've been using it quite a bit in conjunction with my morph brush technique as well, and it's made the whole detailing process in ZBrush all the more powerful. So hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next lesson.